Alright, in this video we're going to be talking about morality. Is morality subjective or is it objective? Is it wrong to murder, officially, absolutely, objectively, or is it subjective? We're going to deal with issues like this, and these are important issues, to be sure. And I've talked about this before, but I think I have some new things to bring to the table, so bear with me. I read a book called After Virtue, and I'd recommend it to you guys out there, but I know most of you probably won't end up reading it, so why don't I just explain what the book proposes and do my best to articulate the argument found in the book. The book opens up with a scenario. Imagine a world where people hate science, and they actually kill scientists and burn textbooks and destroy technology and persecute and ostracize supporters of science and all that sort of stuff. Now imagine many years go by and then there's a renaissance where people attempt to recover science. So what they end up doing is piecing together fragments of burned books or bits and pieces of technology, and they kind of pool it all together and they attempt to recover science. And what they end up doing, perhaps, is they recover much of the language of science. So they'll use words like the scientific method, or they'll use even categories of scientific inquiry like biology or astronomy. And maybe in the individual fields, they'll even have the words that we typically use, like in astronomy, like galaxies and nebula and supernova. However, there's a distinction between the way that people use it in the recovered state versus the old way that people used it. And the distinction is this. The recovered science, when it uses these scientific words, perhaps they don't have the same content as they once did. Perhaps so much information is missing that when someone says supernova, they don't mean the explosion of a star anymore. What they mean is, on page 300 of that broken book or a scrap of paper, there is a diagram of a supernova which seems to have maybe something to do with it's too vague to be very specific about. But that's what the modern science, in this recovered state of science, has come to call the supernova. And it's robbed of its original context in the way it was discovered, and it has none of the information, the content of the original discovery. Only the language remains. So if you overheard a conversation in the recovered science state, you'd hear words like, nebula or supernova, and you may even be deceived into thinking that they were talking scientifically, but they're not. They're only talking about what they've recovered, and that's not much. Now, what's the point of all this? The author of the book argues that something like this has happened with morality, that there was once a foundation, a robust understanding of morality, and that was rebelled against during the Enlightenment period. And now people still use the language. They've recovered the language of morality. So they say things like right and wrong, good and evil, but those words don't mean what they once did. And I'm going to explain what the distinction is. Let's take a look at traditional morality versus modern morality and see if we can really make a distinction between the two and maybe see a few problems in the modern system of morality. The Enlightenment Project, as the book After Virtue calls it, is the attempt of the Enlightenment world, the world post-Enlightenment, of trying to justify their moral system. Now, let's look at the traditional view before the Enlightenment, what it looked like. This is the view that Aristotle and Augustine and many of the famous philosophers of the past held to. Alright, so let's take a look at the traditional view of morality. I believe that there's been a moral crisis in our culture which has resulted in moral relativism and moral subjectivity, which leaves us without a true method to judge between what is right and what is wrong. And those who claim to have a standard are actually now seen as bigoted, close-minded, and dangerous to our culture, sort of like the scenario with people rebelling against science. Now here's what I believe happened. The traditional view of morality made a distinction between what is moral and immoral by way of a guiding law. In the West we call it the law of God. In the East they called it the Tao. Now the law of God, or the Tao, was not to be defined by man, but was meant to be strived towards. It was not to be altered by man, but it was meant to alter us. The traditional view is that there is man as he is, and man as he should be. The way to distinguish between the two was the law of God, or the Tao. Our modern culture has denied entirely the existence of this law, leaving only the moral injunction and language of right and wrong. Man as he is, and man as he should be, but but without a standard by which to judge which category to place certain behaviors. Therefore, when we observe that man is a homosexual or a heterosexual, a murderer or a savior, a pedophile, a rapist, a thief, how do we know which category to put it in? At this point, it is only a matter of personal preference, and the danger is this. What if we put something in the wrong category and justify something that is actually immoral? What if that law of God does exist? Once you reject the law of God or the Tao, or the objective standard, you are left with absolute moral chaos, moral relativism, emotivism, utilitarianism, and all other failed attempts at justifying morality. It boils down to this. Either man defines what is right for man to do, in which case no man can tell any other man what is right or wrong, or something that is not man defines what is right and wrong for man to do, and will judge man according to that standard. The traditional view predicts that man as he is, by nature, will hate the idea that he could ever be in the wrong, and the traditional view is designed, by definition, to put at odds the way man is versus the way he ought to be. So if this view is correct, we should expect man as he is to reject the Tao, to reject the law of God, as well as the idea that man ought to be any which way. And I suppose that gives some people license in their mind to be any which way they want to be, to define their own morality, to be their own God, which of course is precisely the lie of Satan in the Garden of Eden. That's his shtick. It's to deny what God said.